You're good to go.
Okay, thanks so much. And hello, everyone. We're so glad that you could join us today for the very first ACRL Access Services Interest Group virtual forum. So a big thanks to the folks at ACRL for allowing us to host this free of charge, and specifically to Elois, who's helped us with all of the technology set up today. And a big thanks to Brad Warren from Yale, who is the Access Services Interest Group convener and has created this new community for all of us. So I'm Kristen Meyer, the User Experience Librarian at Grand Valley State University, and in my position, I manage our single service desk and lead a team of user experience staff and students. While I don't directly supervise our UX students, my fantastic staff member Deb does that. She and I collaborate on shaping our student employment program. And today I'm with Brian Mary, Head of Operations and User Services, which is the department formerly known as Access Services at Grand Valley, and we're both really excited about hosting this virtual forum focused on student employment. So while we're planning to share specifics about our student employment model with you in a presentation format, we're also hoping that this forum will be somewhat interactive in nature and that you'll share some of your ideas and practices with us too. So we have about 65 minutes of content to share, and we hope to use the remaining time answering questions and hearing about all of the cool stuff that all of you are doing too. So please note, if you're just joining us, that we are recording the session today, and you'll all be receiving an email with a link to the recording probably next week. So for today's agenda, we're going to first provide some background about the larger philosophical conversations that we had within our department that sort of led us down the path to our current student employment model at GVSU. And then later we'll dig into the specifics about student recruiting and hiring, training, and evaluation. I also want to point out that all of your mics are muted, but feel free to type in questions in your chat box at any time. We might be able to answer some of the questions right away, and some we might wait until the end to answer, but go ahead and just type them in there anytime. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand this over to Brian, who's going to jump right into the next section.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Kristen, and hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be with you all today. Can everybody hear me okay? If somebody could just, okay, good, thank you. I also want to take a moment to acknowledge Brad Warren for his time, talent, and leadership in getting this interest group off the ground and making forums like today possible. I think we had over 250 registrants today, people who had registered. So it's really a great opportunity for us to share and learn from one another. So we really appreciate your leadership, Brad. Thank you again. I'd also like to quickly acknowledge Carlos Rodriguez, who is a huge part of our story at Grand Valley State University, some of which we will be sharing with you today. But Carlos has moved on to accept a deanship with California State University, Los Angeles, and Kristen and I just wanted to give him a quick shout out to him and his new staff out there. So if you're listening, hello, Carlos. Okay, so before we dive directly into student employment, I think it is important that we examine the landscape of access services a little bit and acknowledge and consider our changing environments, how that impacts library services, specifically access services, and in turn, the changing roles for library staff and access services at all levels, including student employment. Some thoughtful analysis about the bigger picture happening in access services was an extremely valuable part of our reorganization, which led to a more prominent role for student employees, but we didn't necessarily start our conversations with a goal in mind to address student employment in any specific way. Hold on, let me move the slide over. So all of that really was an outcome of larger conversations we started having with our teams. So for those of you considering what role student employees fulfill or could fulfill at your institutions, I think it is very important to put some thought into the purpose of the entire department and consider how all employment groups work together to position us to best meet user needs. This is a great way to approach how you perceive the role people play in your organizations and might help you to see student employment in a new or different light perhaps. So I'll be spending some time talking a little bit about the transformation of our department at GVSU with that bigger picture in mind, and having the context about our background will also be important to consider as we overview our student employment program, which again was developed as our philosophy and environmental variables began to crystallize through these larger conversations. So Kristen will definitely be spending significant time later in the presentation going over our student employment program in detail, sharing our new approaches and some very helpful and innovative tips. Okay, so on the slide before you are some questions I'd like to spend a little bit of time talking about and encourage you all to think about these questions, not just as you examine student employment, but as you think about why access services exist and question whether or not you are positioned to best meet the needs of your primary audiences. So the top question there, what's changed in access services? What are those emerging needs and how are we identifying these needs? Who are our primary audiences and how are we responding to their needs? How do we need to potentially reorganize ourselves to deliver? And then really the big question in access services, why do we exist? What is our purpose and how do we make and articulate our big impact? And we should always start here. In 2011, when we really started examining how we were positioned to meet user needs, we came across Simon Sinek's Start With Why TED Talk. We actually had intentions of showing the video of Sinek introducing the concept of a golden circle today. However, we kind of had some technical difficulties during our practice session, so I just wanted to briefly summarize it for you and let you know that that was sort of vital in shaping our philosophy and the new lens in which we examine everything we do. But Simon Sinek, states that good organizations start with the why rather than the what or the how. His golden circle concept is a model for how successful organizations interact with their customers. So in this model, he defines the why as the reason organization exists and acts as it does. And he explains the why should lie at the center of every decision. The what and the how should evolve over time and bring life to the why. So historically in access services, and our organization was no exception, people tend to pass time-honored traditions, policies, and procedures from one generation of staff to the next without stopping to ask, why do we do things this way? Does this produce the best outcome for our users? So very quickly, before I move on, please go ahead and type in 1 or 2 words into the chat box that are at the center of why you all exist in your organizations. And the chat box is on your right-hand side there for those of you that might not have figured that out yet. But while you're doing that, I would just also encourage you to watch the full 18-minute version of the TED Talk or read Sinek's book, Start With Why. We've provided a link to the shorter version of the video on our slide there. Okay, so I just strongly encourage you all to, well, it looks like we had a couple come in, so some interesting whys starting to pour in there, and just encourage you all to engage in some discussion with staff in your area to further explore your why. Establishing our why was key to our ability to move conversations forward and work with our teams to examine how we conduct our work in access services, and really became the foundation for what was an 18-month-long workflow analysis and eventual transformation into our updated service delivery model that I'll overview in a little bit. But as you can see in the graphic, our why focuses on student success and our ability to support student learning. As we worked with our teams to examine workflows in our areas, our spaces and our furnishings, our loan rules, we asked ourselves and continue to ask ourselves as we make decisions one simple question: is this best for students? Will this decision, policy, or space configuration create an optimal experience for our students to enhance their learning and their work as they interact in our spaces and with us? Now, it's important to note that our why might not be your why, but it's very important to have these in conversations with people in your units so you can have a refreshed and shared vision as you examine your work, and in our case, whether or not the what and how we deliver services is best for students. In many ways, this approach made it easier to identify and make changes I believe some people on our team may have found difficult otherwise, changes that would eventually heavily impact some of their roles with us. So establishing our why was very important to our transition, not just to elicit staff buy-in, but to move away from a very library-centric service model to a much more user and student-focused one. So having those internal discussions is important, and as I mentioned, so is some examination of the larger question about what has changed in access services, and more specifically, what is changing at your institutions. As you can see on this slide, I've listed some common things which have evolved in access services over time, and I'm sure many of you will quickly identify with these. These really still point more towards the what and how we enable access to information or design spaces or create policies, but these evolving issues really don't help us define our purpose. And I think that's sort of the narrative in access services right now. What is our purpose, and how do we make a big splash or convey our impact and contribution to the wider library community and throughout our institutions? A while back, a few years back, Carlos shared with me the book, 21st Century Access Services on the Frontline of Academic Librarianship. And this was a book published in 2013, and many of our colleagues in access services contributed chapters on a variety of topics relevant still today. So it's a great read. But in his foreword, I think Jim Neal has articulated the purpose and potential impact of access services as well as anyone. He talks about the many ways in which access services interacts with the majority of library users and the invaluable perspective access services staff can contribute to more informed decision making that can create more positive experiences for library users. So if we can find better ways to harness information about how users experience our spaces and services, I think we have a powerful story we can tell to our administrators that add value, not just to access services, but to the academic library's presence at their respective institutions. So as we examined our purpose at GVSU, one of our primary objectives was to come up with a way we could gather more information about students interacting with us, and so that we could more proactively respond to their needs. So how can we package that information, evaluate it, and share it to impact positive changes that enhance the user experience? As we considered some of the things noted in this slide and started analyzing the nature of activity happening in our service desk environment, so for example, discoverability is easier than it once was, and inquiries coming into our service desk were more straightforward. We really started to consider our student employees as a way forward. Some economic context here is also worth noting. As we started to identify these emerging needs or initiatives we wanted to address, we didn't exactly have new staff lines growing on trees, as I'm sure many of you don't. So we felt student employees might be an underutilized resource we could leverage. At the time, we were also learning about the benefits of peer-to-peer learning through our research consultant student employment group. And since our primary audience on our main campus is undergraduates, we saw an opportunity to enhance the role of student employees to kind of lower that threshold and connect with students in a new way. So the outcome of our transformation was a reorganization of access services to operations and user services, in which we have a front of the house team and a back of the house team. So it's sort of like a restaurant model in which your front of the house staff deal with customer service and interact with users, while your back of the house kitchen staff prepare the meals. Both need to work well together to create a positive experience. Our front of the house group is called User Experience, and we pulled away all tangible and process-related tasks and assigned them to our back of the house group we call Access and Delivery. With this new model, we basically cut our traditional circulation students into these respective and more specialized groups. In the past, our circ students worked the desk environment and spent time away from the desk shelving books, etc. With this new approach, they have more specialized responsibilities, which help us focus recruiting and training efforts for really what are very diverse types of work when you consider a busy service desk environment versus the task-oriented work like shelf reading, for example. So some people aren't really gifted at both types of work, especially considering they only work for us 10 or 15 hours a week. And that's really a pretty big learning curve if we are to raise expectations and add responsibilities to their roles. Now, a little bit more about our environment. We are a single service desk at GVSU in which we do offer basic reference services. At the time of our transition, we made the decision to staff our desk with student employees as the primary employment group on the front line. So we haven't had librarians or paraprofessional staff work our service desk in several years now, which really has raised the bar for what we need to expect out of our user experience student employees. This move has enabled us to do a variety of other things we never had time to do before or just weren't adequately positioned to do in the past, such as studying user behavior and collecting data. We now have an evidence-based approach to help us tell our story about what students need so that we can elicit support and funding. And this has also enabled us to ask our full-time staff to take on new things. So roles at all levels have evolved, which certainly required us to reconsider everything we knew about student employment. So why do any of us even hire student employees to begin with? Traditionally, it has been to address basic task-oriented functions in the department, but we started to realize they have potential to make a greater contribution. They give us incredible insight into how students experience the library, into what students' wants and needs are, and if we are more intentional about how we engage student employees and maybe think about expanding their role, they really offer us a perspective most full-time staff cannot. A higher level of engagement and expectation for us has also resulted in a much more motivated group of individuals who have become among our greatest advocates. So when we have conversations about meeting user needs, space and service design, UX research and training initiatives, we always like to include our student employees to get their ideas and perspective. One more important note about what we wanted to achieve with our student employment program was that we did not just see them as a potential means to a better service delivery model. We also wanted to be more intentional about providing them with high-impact learning experiences that would enhance their education at GVSU and better prepare them for postgraduate life. We really wanted to create a rich experience for them, and we think we've done that. We focus on skill building in a variety of ways, and Kristen will outline some of the ways we've achieved that here in just a little bit. Oh, it looks like we have a couple of questions that came in. So, did we have resistance from patrons when we started staffing the desk with students? A little bit, absolutely. I think anytime you're leading a group of people, especially people that are passionate about what they do and who maybe have been in the profession for a long time, through this sort of change, I think you're met with some level of resistance. Oh, from patrons, I see. Not really. Our primary audience is undergrads, and we actually have a very effective outreach program with our liaison librarians working with faculty throughout campus. And so they were a huge part of making sure that faculty were comfortable with what we were doing. And we also have our full-time staff in fairly close proximity. if do happen to be questions that students struggle with. But by and large, we've gotten really good feedback from our patrons. The second question, do you still staff a supervisor during an open hours, even if they do not work at the desk directly? Yes, we're a fairly decent-sized library. We're 5 stories, and you know, we easily average probably 600 to 800 people in the building during peak times, and during peak times in the semester, we're over 1,000 people in the building. So we always like to have full-time staff in the building, especially to help us with some of the safety and emergency preparedness type of things, and also to give students support and guidance. Okay, so a little bit more about our user experience students, give you a high-level overview of what they do. I mentioned they work in our single service desk environment, answering a wide variety of questions and logging them. They log our questions into our stat tracker platform. We use libanalytics. They also conduct hourly roams, collecting a variety of space usage data. They help us identify facilities-related issues that might need attention, or sometimes they might just do an old-fashioned head count for us. They participate in more targeted data collection about how students are utilizing various spaces, furnishings, and technologies, and this really has enabled our ability to better identify and proactively respond to student needs. And this data has also informed decision-making at the library administration level, including impactful budget decisions that enhance the user experience. So our administrators and people on up the food chain at the university receive access to some of the data we collect and have really taken notice and they've really come to put a lot of stock into what our UX team is discovering in their work, and that's been pretty exciting to see. But other functions that our user experience students fulfill for us, they give tours to some pretty high-profile groups coming in to see our new library. They participate in both the development and implementation of training activities for newer students. They participate in hiring, and they even participate in the development of research activities Kristen might be spearheading. So to wrap up a bit here, I've come up with a simple flow chart for how anyone could go about exploring changes in your respective areas, and I've utilized student employment as the example shown. At the top of the chart, you see the word examine. We spent quite a bit of time examining and discussing why we even exist and exploring whether or not the what and how we deliver library services matches our focus, our philosophy, and our shared goals that came out of those why discussions. The result of that was some form of change or evolution in our area. For us, one of the more significant outcomes led to an expanded role for student employees, which then led us down the path of rethinking how we recruit, how we train, how we hire and evaluate their effectiveness. So I think similar discussions with your teams may result in some other form of change that has a positive impact on your work and those you serve. So I believe this to be a very effective approach to facilitate meaningful discussion and change, probably beyond even student employment. Okay, I think we have time for another quick question or two before Kristen addresses recruiting. So if any of you have more questions about our service model, our transformation, how that's impacted staff in our area, I didn't talk a lot about that. I'd be happy to address any of those things. Okay, so I have a question here. Were there any concerns regarding job security from the full-time staff? Did they feel like we were replacing them with students? That's a great question. We actually didn't deal with a lot of that. We took a very inclusive approach to coming up with this service delivery model. We showed the Simon Sinek's Start With Why TED Talk with the entire staff. We talked about, what is our purpose, what's our why. We worked with everybody, all of our full-time staff to develop goals and guiding principles that helped us sort of come up with all this stuff. So they were very involved at the get-go, and there was some anxiety for what it would mean to them because we didn't really know what the outcomes were at that point in time. But you know, again, I think that's why it was really important for us to establish our why, because every time conversations got stuck in terms of managing or facilitating change, or anytime staff expressed some anxiety, you know, we could just point back to, hey, this is all going to be better for the students in the end, and that's what we're all about. And, you know, we didn't really have to go out our way to promise people that they'd still have a job. So that was never really an option on the table. And at some point through the process, it started to become more clear how they would be spending their time at work too, which certainly was helpful. Another question, did you experience challenges as far as turnover rates with the students? Not a lot. At the time, we rolled this new service delivery model out a year before we moved into our new library. And so a lot of our veteran circulation students, we gave the choice which group they wanted to work with. And so we do have 2 student supervisors. The access and delivery student supervisor reports to me, and the user experience student supervisor reports to Kristen. And so we kind of gave students a choice and worked with the student supervisors to find them an appropriate home. And that transition actually went fairly smoothly. And Kristen's going to talk about some of the ways that we involved them in our student employment program too, that sort of, I think, helped that part along. Okay, if there are no more questions, I think we'll go ahead and, oh, was there a couple more? Oh, there's one I think I see. Our staff enjoy working the service desk as well. Did your staff miss this? So I think Kristen might cover some of this in a little bit, but our staff are just a little bit removed from the service desk environment in that they're not the ones directly dealing with walk-up traffic, but they're in a position to oversee the desk activity in case students do have a question. So they do have a safety net, although our staff's focus is more to deal with our virtual chat service, answer phone calls, and do some of those types of things. So I think they still have enough exposure to where they don't miss it too much. And let's see, do your behind the desk staff also work in your stacks/shelving unit? Is there a combined unit? There is not a combined unit. We do have A&D staff that sort of wear that hat primarily, that do work the service desk environment, but our UX, we have user experience full-time staff that also work the service desk environment, and what they focus on off desk are all related to the end user experience. So they'll be helping Kristen with training initiatives or research initiatives that help us better understand the end user, but our UX staff don't focus on any of those task-oriented functions while they're off desk. Okay. Do you want to go ahead?
Okay, I also see that we have a question about complex research questions, and that's a great question. We get that a lot. Actually, we do record all of the desk transactions, so all of the questions that are asked at the desk, and it turns out that we actually have very few complicated research questions that are asked in a walk-up capacity. We do have more complicated research questions sometimes asked through chat. That seems to be a little bit the place where those kinds of questions come in to us more than in a walk-up fashion. But we do have a small percentage, like maybe I think it's under 10%, like something like 6% of all of our questions that are asked are sort of higher level reference questions. And for those questions, so students have really 3 options when they come in and have a research or reference question. First, they can always ask at the service desk, and we'll definitely connect them to where they need to get that answer if we don't have that answer. We have something called the Knowledge Market. So we do have student research consultants who do one-on-one 30 to 60-minute consultations with students. And so our Knowledge Market is open in the afternoon up until like 11 p.m. So students who walk up to the desk, and if our students can't answer a question, they can be walked right over to the Knowledge Market. Also, our liaison librarians are available for one-on-one consultations, typically through standard business hours, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. And so if someone had a question that we can answer at the desk, we would definitely call to see if that liaison was available and walk the student right up there.
Okay, just a couple more questions before we move on. There was a question about retention of student employees. Our student employees love to work here, and we have really high retention rates. We actually get a lot of feedback from even after they graduate about what they're up to. So they like working for us. Let's see, I saw a question about what wage model do we use. So we do encourage student supervisors to hire work study students, but we don't have to exclusively do that. And our UX students make the minimum wage that the campus offers student employment, and then there's sort of a step increase that they follow after that. So a lot of the ways that we recruit, Kristen will talk about more in just a second. We actually advertise the experience that they can gain by working with us and things of that nature. So I would say that the wage isn't the primary motivator there. How many students work? Kristen mentioned 2 to 3 students work at once. So we always have 1 or 2 on the desk and usually have 1 roaming around. I think why do your students love to work for you? I think because we really treat them like professionals and engage with them, and they really respond well to that. Okay, I think we should probably move on. We'll have more time for questions in just a minute or two. I wanted to just talk a little bit more about the benefits of thoughtful recruiting. Given the more prominent position we're placing students in, it was naturally to our benefit to reconsider how we recruit and hire them. And there has been a lot of benefit to a more strategic approach than what we had in the past. So in the past, with our traditional CERC students, that sort of one-size-fits-all model, we didn't put as much thought into skills we looked for or questions we asked potential student employees. It could be we would hire someone with strong attention to detail, for example, which was great for the task-oriented side of things, but then we would just go ahead and plop them into our busy service desk environment, which could be pretty problematic for everybody involved. So if you do consider changing student employee roles in some way, that obviously requires some thought into how you describe their work, how you recruit and train them. Our new approach, Kristen will outline shortly, but it has enabled us to better recruit skill sets that match an updated position. We've invited our full-time staff and veteran students into ongoing discussions about how recruiting is handled, which has garnered quite a bit of buy-in for our model. For the student employees themselves, a more formal and methodical recruiting process has been a great way to establish expectations, build excitement, and again, garner buy-in right out of the gate as we hire them. Including veteran students in the process is also a great way to help them build some important professional skills, and it's really resulted in students who are highly motivated and have become great ambassadors for us. So, okay, I'm going to go ahead and give the ball now to Kristen, who will elaborate on our peer hiring practices.
Okay, thanks, Brian. So we found that peer hiring, let me just advance the slide here. So we found that peer hiring, which just basically means involving current student workers in the hiring of new students, is really beneficial and really serves a dual purpose. So in addition to providing us with valuable feedback, participation also gives existing students the opportunity to experience the hiring process from an employer's perspective. When students finish their time with us and graduate, we send them an exit survey asking them what they learned and what was the most beneficial aspect of their position. And we've received numerous comments from students that vetting applications and sitting in on interviews was really helpful and has made them more confident starting the job search process after graduation. So when we talk about student recruiting and hiring, we're really talking about several distinct pieces: a job description, an application rubric, an interview, and an interview rubric. I'll talk about each of those elements in more detail, but let me start with just a quick overview. So first, we have a customized job description for our UX students, detailing the work, the requirements, and the benefits of the employee. Potential student employees fill out an application, which is again specific to the UX student position. When we review applicants, we use an application rubric to help us choose students to interview, which can actually help eliminate bias in the hiring process. And when we interview students, we complete an interview rubric to help us make final hiring decisions. So I've actually shared our UX student recruiting and hiring plan with you as a PDF document. Let me just show you that here. So this is our whole recruiting and hiring plan, and it should have all of the pieces like that I've just mentioned, so our job description and our application. And you'll have that available. We can send that all out to you along with the link as well. So we'll talk about each of those, even though we have that plan and we'll send that to you. Let's go ahead and talk about the details of each of them. I do want to note up front that at our institution, we're not required to only hire work study students. I see there were a couple of questions about that in the chat window. We do try to hire work study students as much as possible because that's good for us. They still go through the same application process as other students. And I do think that despite your institutional requirements, all students, whether they're work study or not, can really benefit from a thoughtful recruiting and hiring process. So first, let's talk about job descriptions. Creating a job description that is specific about what a student job includes, requires, and what students will gain from the experience can really help set expectations and help students decide whether or not this position might be the right fit for them right out of the gate. In our UX student job description, we intentionally describe the purpose of the UX team so that students really understand our values and what we're all to apply for this position. We also are intentional about articulating job responsibilities. We understand that not every student wants to work in a fast-paced environment or would be comfortable giving tours, assisting with emergency and safety procedures, and helping us conduct user experience research by doing things like collecting data and going up to people and asking them to do a short interview for them. And that's why we've been really intentional about listing these requirements. That gives students the opportunity to self-select whether or not they have the skills and motivation to perform this work. In the last year or two, we added a section on employment outcomes, articulating what students can expect to learn in this position. We do this as both a recruiting tool, so we want students to know that they're going to be getting a whole lot from this experience, as well as a teaching tool. We've noticed that students aren't always aware of what they've learned in this position and subsequently aren't always good at articulating that in cover letters and interviews in future positions. When we post an open position, we put it on our campus-wide job board page as well as the library website. We've also recently started emailing the leaders of student groups on campus to let them know about the open positions, specifically targeting groups that are comprised of students from underrepresented backgrounds. Diversity and inclusion are priorities at our institution, and we think it's really important to have a diverse set of student workers. Casting a wider net at the beginning of the hiring process might be able to help us do this. And going even a little bit further, we know that there's a lack of diversity in the library profession as a whole. And we also know that many student workers end up entering the library field professionally, right? Perhaps then, if we can increase the diversity of our student workers, we can also impact, at least maybe to some small degree, the diversity of our profession. So in our UX student applications, we ask standard application questions, but we also include some short answer questions. These questions can be a bit of a challenge for students, again, elevating the expectations for this position right from the start. These questions also give us some of the best information about potential students. If a student indicates that they want to work for the library because they really like to read in quiet environments, we know that this probably isn't the job for them. The next component of our process is an application rubric. When I've attended campus-wide seminars on inclusive hiring practices, I've learned that we all have some implicit bias when we select candidates to interview. One strategy that can help limit this bias is to use rubrics to judge application materials. It's also important to use a rubric when multiple individuals are involved in the process of reviewing applications, because some people might prioritize skills and experiences differently, and the rubric attempts to normalize these individual differences. The application rubric that we use is really pretty simple, and it's gone through several revisions as we've practiced using it. If you're going to start implementing an application rubric and you'll have multiple people using it, I would recommend having a brief training exercise where all of the people using the rubric will review the same application, score it out, and then talk about why they may have scored it differently. Conducting formal interviews with potential student employees is as much for them as it is for you. It'll provide you with valuable information for hiring decisions, and it will give them an interview experience. I don't know about all of you, but I know that I've learned something every time that I've ever been interviewed for a job. And each of those experiences made me better for future interviews, right? And as I mentioned before, sitting in on these interviews and filling out an application rubric is also very beneficial to the current students who participate. So our interviews consist of some pretty standard interview questions and an activity at the end. Probably my two favorite questions are, first, tell me about a time when you received good customer service, and how did you know it was good customer service? And my other favorite is, what new service or space would you add to the library to make it better? And if any of you have interview questions that have worked well for you, please share them in the chat box. And maybe we can also get a list of these going on the interest group listserv after today's forum. So at the end of our interviews, we ask students to give us an impromptu tour of our office suite. Building tours are part of the UX student job responsibilities, and this activity helps us identify whether or not students can think on their feet, be personable, and make personal connections with others. Interestingly, this idea actually came from a small group activity at a student employment workshop that Brian and I facilitated for other libraries. So one of the groups came up with that idea, and it's worked really great for us. So during or after the interviews, our staff and student employees participating in the interview fill out an interview rubric for the potential candidate. Research indicates that interviewers generally make up their mind about an interviewee within the first 10 seconds of the interview, and then spend the remaining time noticing evidence that supports that first impression and filtering out evidence that contradicts that impression. Of course, these first impressions are often the result, again, of all kinds of implicit bias. So while our interview rubric is pretty basic, it does help our interviewers take a more measured approach in making final hiring decisions. And that, in a nutshell, is our approach to recruiting and hiring. And so before we move on to talk about training, we'd like to stop and answer some questions. Okay, so the first one is, to participate in hiring, do your student employees have to attend HR training like staff and faculty do? Actually, our faculty and staff don't have to attend HR training before they participate in hiring practices, although of course we have a lot of opportunities at our university to participate in training that helps with that. So no, our students do not have to participate in that. However, we do offer our own training session for them, just on sort of, you know, again, like to talk about the hiring process and how to vet applications and how to use the interview scoring rubric. And generally, in their participation in the interviews, you know, they're kind of there to make the other student feel comfortable. They talk about what it's like to work at the library and what their role is kind of from their perspective. Sometimes the potential student candidate will have questions for them. And then they alternate asking questions, but all of the questions they ask are on that predetermined list. Okay, the next question was, do you provide feedback to students about how their interview went regardless of the outcome? That's a really great question. You know, we've done this maybe informally when the students that we contact and let them know that they haven't been selected for a position, if they sort of ask for that feedback. Also, sometimes students who might have a skill set that would work better, for example, in our A&D, we ask that, or we kind of encourage them to apply for other positions in the library if there's one that meets their particular skill set a little bit better. But that's a great idea. I think maybe asking students if they would like that feedback could be a really nice idea. Okay, and it looks like we have a couple more. Oh, that's a great question. So the question is, what percentage of applicants in your pool are hired? That has really varied. So we have played around with when we open the position and when we close it. So last year, we adjusted our timeline so that we could hire over the summer so that students would know whether or not they received work-study awards. And that actually reduced our pool of students. So this year we're going to change that timeline again a little bit. So it just sort of depends. Sometimes our pools have been very large and then, you know, a smaller percentage of students are hired. This last time when I mentioned we had many fewer applicants, we had probably 35 applicants this summer, and we hired like 6 of them. Okay. Okay. The rest that I'm seeing are, I think, mainly interview questions that have worked, and if I've missed anything, we'll be sure to circle back around to that at the end. Okay, so let's go ahead and move along and talk about student training. Now, we all know that training takes time and resources, and especially if you're going to kind of change the work of your students and have them do a little bit higher level work, you'll definitely have to value and invest in training for those students. I recommend putting together a training plan before you create a new student group or significantly change the work that an existing student group does. GVSU's UX Student Training Plan is comprised of 4 major components. So first, a mandatory day-long orientation occurs at the beginning of the fall semester. On-the-ground training happens the first several weeks of a student's employment. Skill development workshops are offered throughout the semester and are often facilitated by our liaison librarians. And a variety of what I like to call anytime activities can be completed by students anytime when it's slow at the desk. Now, our particular training plan is designed to meet our specific needs and environment. And I'm going to share the details of our plan with you, but with the understanding that not everything that we do might be applicable or achievable in your environment, but with the hope that this might help spark some new ideas that you could use in your own training efforts. There are 2 guiding principles that help guide our training efforts. First is the importance of story. In the book, Made to Stick, which is one of my very favorite professional books of all time, Chip and Dan Heath argue that a compelling narrative is the best way to ensure that an idea sticks with people. I think very intentionally about the stories that we share with students, and this seems to be especially effective during our day-long orientations. There are a few stories in particular that help students really get what UX is and why we do the work that we do. The second guiding principle is really just all about fun. So a few years ago, Brian and I watched a short video called The Piano Stairs, made by Volkswagen, and the link is on the slide here. Basically, a group wanted to get more people to take the stairs than the escalator for health reasons. So instead of just putting up a sign that said something like, take the stairs, make a healthy choice, they actually made the stairs into functioning piano keys that would play music as someone walked across them. People enjoyed this, they had fun, and Volkswagen coined the fun theory, the belief that we can more effectively change people's behavior through fun. This really resonated with both Brian and I, and we quite often talk about the fun theory, actually in regards to all kinds of work in our department. But this is really what led me to trying some elements of gamification in our training efforts. Maybe students would find it more enjoyable and fun if we added game-like elements to our training initiative. We've done this in a few different ways, primarily in our anytime training activities, and I'll talk in more detail about those in just a few minutes. But for now, I just wanted you to understand that storytelling and gamification are two principles that help guide our training practices. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the foundation of our training plan is a day-long orientation at the beginning of our fall semester. The purpose of orientation is to, 1, introduce students to the organization and what we're all about. 2, explain what their role is at a higher level, so really dig into the why behind their positions. And 3, build the team. You'll notice that I did not mention that the purpose of orientation is to provide detailed knowledge about specific tasks. We think that information is most effectively shared in on-the-ground training, and we don't focus on this at all during orientation. Attending orientation is a mandatory part of employment for returning and new students, and they do get paid for attending orientation. One of the reasons that we think it's important for returning students to attend is that it really can help with team building, and it also allows for opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. We design activities so that returning students are very purposefully sharing their knowledge with new students. This time also serves as a refresher for students, reminding them why we're all here. Of course, occasionally returning students have very legitimate reasons to miss orientation, and we've made some minor exceptions along the way. So orientation includes role-playing, such as customer service skits, which are always a hit, engaging activities, stories, and large group discussions, all designed intentionally to introduce students at a high level to concepts such as our environment and our service philosophy. So I'll give you an example of one of the activities that we do. It's called the foam finger activity. So basically, I ask for 3 volunteers and take them out of the room. I tell them that they're all going to pretend to be walking around selling foam fingers at a baseball game. The first person is going to be a very unenthusiastic, bored foam finger salesperson, half-heartedly dragging the foam finger around and looking like it's the most miserable thing in the world. The second person is going to be a great foam finger salesperson, being enthusiastic and friendly, looking like they genuinely love foam fingers. The third person is going to be over-the-top enthusiastic, being obnoxious with the foam finger, perhaps getting in people's way and hitting them in the head with a foam finger. So I give the students those instructions, then I go back to the rest of the audience and tell them to pretend that they're at a baseball game and to pay attention to the foam finger salesperson that they're going to encounter. The 3 volunteers do their thing, everyone laughs at the first and third salespeople, and then I facilitate a group discussion. This activity gives us a great opportunity to talk about how greeting and approachability are so important at the desk, how we're really almost selling library services, and how giving good service means that you have to determine what level of service someone wants at that moment, right? You don't want to be like that obnoxious foam finger salesperson. Students remember this activity because it's fun and memorable. Survey results indicate that these activities are students' favorite parts of orientation. Well, that and the food. Other activities that have been successful for us include an activity where we had groups of students produce commercials advertising various library services. They filmed the commercials using iPads, and we watched them as a group and then voted on our top 2 favorites. We've also tried some photo scavenger hunts. One of our most successful photo scavenger hunt was one that helped students remember essentially an elevator speech about the library. We always tell students that if they forget everything about the library, if they just remember 3 words, inspiration, flexibility, and support, they can quickly highlight some of the most important aspects of the library to whoever they're talking to. So during orientation, we divided the students into 3 teams: Team Inspiration, Team Flexibility, and Team Support. The students went around with iPads and took photos of things that represented their particular theme. At the end, students had a chance to show their pictures to the group and talk about how those images reflected their particular theme. Students had fun, and it was a memorable way to get students to remember those 3 key themes about our library spaces and services. Overall, we have seen significant benefits from holding orientations. Orientation builds a sense of pride and confidence. It helps students see the big picture, but to know that there will be many other opportunities for further learning as they stay with us. It raises expectation. It creates buy-in and strong library ambassadors. And finally, orientation gets our students' wheels turning about how this job will relate to their future careers. Although we avoid for training for specific tasks during orientation, we recognize that helping students gain a solid understanding of specific tasks is still important. There are all kinds of policies and procedures that students need to learn. We handle this by having a detailed checklist that new students go through with returning students and staff during their first weeks of employment. We've found that completing the checklist over a few weeks, rather than cramming it in a day or 2, seems to help with retaining that knowledge. We've also found that getting multiple staff and students involved can be really beneficial and foster a sense of team. The next component of our training plan are skill development workshops, which are offered throughout the semester. You can see a list of some of the workshops that we've offered, and many of these are conducted by our liaison librarians. In addition to our UX students, other student employees and library staff often attend. We try to offer 5 to 6 workshops per semester. UX students have to attend 2 sessions per semester, and they get paid, and they can be paid for up to 3 workshops. We found that staggering the workshops throughout the year and throughout a student's employment hones skills without overwhelming them. It allows them to meet other library employees and ultimately seems to increase their confidence. The final component of our training plan is what I call anytime training activities, which are activities that students can complete anytime that it's slow at the service desk. When I first started designing this training, we used a lot of paper worksheets, such as reference challenges, keyword Scrabble, website scavenger hunts, so on. And while we still use these occasionally, we've largely moved to electronic formats. And as I mentioned earlier, this is an area where we try to add elements of gamification. For example, for several semesters, we used a free online quiz tool called Zondel.com, which allows you to create quiz topics for students, and then they can play that quiz topic in a game setting. Unfortunately, though, the Zondel site has just recently closed, so we actually need to start looking for some new alternatives. The last 2 years, though, we've also had team-based games. This year, for example, we implemented the Candyland Challenge. So we divided the students into teams, And during orientation, they sat with their team, they got a team photo taken, decided on a team name, and each of them decorated a paper gingerbread game piece. We had a Candyland board that we created, like a huge one that we created in our office suite just with paper. And each time students would complete online challenges that we created on Blackboard, they would move their game piece through the board. Teams would earn points for every challenge that someone completed, and they would earn bonus points if all of their team members were at a certain point by certain dates. The winning team got GVSU t-shirts. We found that the team approach has been fairly effective at motivating some of the students who aren't quite as excited to do training activities when it's slow at the desk. And students do really appreciate that we try to make the activities as fun as possible. So we budget about $200 per year for training incentives. This is what we used to purchase things like the winning team's t-shirts for Candyland. We've also had other competitions that have resulted in things like small bookstore shopping sprees, free coffee, candy, and then the most inexpensive incentive imaginable, buttons. So students can earn buttons that then they can put on their name lanyards. They can earn those for all kinds of different things, and primarily for completing all kinds of training activities. Our library had actually already purchased a button maker for some other kind of programming. I think you can buy a new one for about $120 though. And once you have the button maker, it only costs about 4 cents per button for the supplies. So Brian, I have to say, was really skeptical at first about the buttons, but we've won him over. The students really love their buttons, and this is a really cheap incentive. So one of the things that we've learned is that it's really beneficial to involve multiple people in the training process. We have multiple UX staff who assist to some degree in developing training activities and in assisting with on-the-ground training. Our liaison librarians are also involved by participating in some activities in orientation, by designing some ongoing activities, and by facilitating some of our workshops. This collaboration helps our students get to know more of our library employees, and involving multiple perspectives makes all of our training elements better than just what one of us could have done on our own. In addition to training, we also like to be intentional about student development. We see our role as not just preparing students to be a UX student worker, but also to help them make the most out of their employment and to make connections between what they're learning on the job and how they might use that in their future careers. We're currently piloting a program that we modified, but that's based on something that our Division of Student Affairs office does with their student workers. On the slide you're seeing, I've placed the purpose statement taken directly from our student learning plan document. It's long, but I'll go ahead and read it to you. The purpose of the UX student learning plan is to help UX students make the most of their employment experience by setting personal goals, connecting with a mentor, and developing an understanding of how the skills that they've gained in this position can translate to their future careers. Academic libraries have always existed to support student learning. This plan reflects our commitment to intentionally offer high-impact learning experiences for the students that we employ. The program consists of 3 components. First, at orientation, students fill out a learning plan document that includes information about employable skills and asks them to reflect on their long-term and short-term goals. I've uploaded it, and I'll just show it to you here. And also, again, we can make sure you have access to this after when we send out the link to the video of today. That's kind of what it looks like. So they fill out that form at orientation, and then the next step in the plan is that students meet with a mentor. So currently, Brian and I, and then another manager in our department, serve as mentors. The purpose of the mentorship meetings is to connect with students, discuss their short-term and long-term goals, and occasionally point them to campus resources that could be useful. The third component of the plan is a workshop that we offer at the end of each academic year. It's called Where Do You Go From Here? And the purpose of the workshop is to get students to really reflect on what they learned as a UX student, how they could apply that to their future careers, and how they could talk about those experiences in a cover letter or an interview. We offered this workshop for the first time last year, and students had really positive feedback about it. And that, in a nutshell, is how we handle training and development in our area. And we just went through a lot of information. So we're happy to pause and spend some time answering questions before we move on to talk about evaluation. And we'd also love to hear about your ideas on training and what you've done.
Okay, Kristen, we have several good questions. I'll just go through some of them quickly here. Would you share your rubrics on the listserv? Yes, we sure will. As part of customer service training, is there a component that deals with internal customers that they could potentially interact with other library departments? I'll quickly weigh in, and then Kristen, if you have anything to add. During orientation, we invite staff from all areas of the library to stop by and say hello, and we do talk about how they're sort of a spoke on the wheel, and there's many other departments, and then we sort of at a high level address referrals and things of that nature. Do you have anything to add to that? Okay. So how do you get all the students to attend orientation at the same time, especially for a full day event? When we hire students as part of our recruiting process, we actually set the date for typically the Thursday or Friday before fall semester starts. And we tell them it's mandatory, and we ask them if they can make that commitment to attend, and that's been very effective for us. How do you maximize attendance? Again, I mentioned that's part of recruiting. We also, as Kristen mentioned, we pay them and we provide a lunch for them, which they seem to really enjoy. And Kristen and our staff make it a really fun day. So I think it's something people actually look forward to. They're coming back and they have an opportunity to see everybody all at once, which is, you know, as you guys know, doesn't happen very often. What does the timing on that all-day orientation look like? What do you have to consider when scheduling? It's typically like a 8 or 9 a.m. to a 3 or 4 p.m. And I mentioned how we handle the scheduling right before fall semester when students are starting to return to campus. What kind of exceptions are considered allowable for missing the orientation? You know, if they're part of another organization or something else going on campus that overlaps with us, I think a discussion's just had with our student supervisor, and if it's a veteran student especially, we'll excuse them. I would say we only have 1 or 2 people every orientation that actually miss, and it's pretty well mandatory for new students. About how many staff are involved in training? Kristen, do you want to comment on that one?
Sure. So myself and our direct student supervisor for the UX student really take the lead on training initiatives. Then we have a staff member who works in the evening who also really does a lot of work helping us develop training activities. And then we have various other staff who might just volunteer to produce like a smaller anytime training activity. And then pretty much all of our staff who work at supporting the students who are at the desk. So all of the staff who work in that area Brian mentioned, that's a little bit behind the service desk. All of those staff do participate, especially in that on-the-ground training, for example.
Okay, another question. Do you allow students to do their homework when it's slow at the desk? We discourage it. It does happen, I'm sure, from time to time. A lot of the activities Kristen highlighted prevent that from happening. Those anytime training activities are fun. In general, we try not to overly police that homework situation, and we sort of teach whether or not you're doing an anytime training activity, you really need to have your head on a swivel and smile and be ready to greet people. And by and large, I think that's working well. You know, again, we purposely pulled away actual work-related, task-oriented processes that we used to do at our service desk environment, just so that we had extra attentive staff and students out front. And we just sort of emphasize that and ask staff to emphasize that when they're overseeing things. Another very good question. I wondered about incorporating games and challenges, but I wonder if it will seem too much like elementary school or summer camp. I'm with you, or I was with you, and Kristen thankfully talked me, didn't have to work too hard, but she talked me out of that concern. So Kristen, you can comment on this one, but it goes on to say, I don't want them to feel like they are being patronized or treated like children. I want them to feel like they are an important part of our team. So have you noticed resistance to the challenges and competitions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, we do work really hard to treat our students very professionally. So they, again, even things like our recruiting and hiring practices really raise expectations for this position. We also really use the feedback of our students to do all kinds of things. So they really are weighing in on issues that end up being, let me say it this way, they actually provide feedback that leads to organizational change within the library to create better experiences for their fellow students. So they really know, and part of orientation is to really let them know, like, they play a really important role in the library. So I think they already feel like we have a lot of respect for them, we're treating them very professionally. We'll get to the evaluation part in a minute, but we give them a professional evaluation. So there's a lot of ways that we try really hard to give them that kind of experience. But actually making the training fun, like, we've had just a lot of really great feedback for that. So for example, this semester we had created this kind of large bingo game, and it asked students to do different things, including like create a doodle of an important document delivery policy, and some of them were like create a children's song based on something. And we kind of gave them the option, like, if you're not feeling creative for any of these particular activities, feel free to just write out your answer in a paragraph form. That way, if they really didn't want to create a children's song, they wouldn't feel obligated to do that. I was a little bit nervous because some of the things I kind of wondered, like, I don't know how many people will do the fun activities. Our whole wall right now is like littered with people's doodles and people's song lyrics back here in our office suite. So it's been, again, it surprised me at how much fun students have with that kind of thing.
Okay, time for just a couple more questions on this. There's a couple more questions about recruiting. In particular, how do we handle recruiting sort of on a last-minute basis, mid-semester, especially with the peer and more collaborative process? The way that we have sort of landed on that issue is just to keep, as applications come in, we usually have at least a couple of people continuously, obviously the student supervisor, but typically somebody else continuously reviewing those applications and filling out the rubrics. And so we kind of have a ready and up-to-date list of candidates interested in working for us. And so if we do have a last-minute need, typically that student supervisor has a short list that's already, the applications have already been peer-reviewed, and then we just do the best we can to schedule an interview and try to incorporate the peer interview process. It doesn't always work out that way, but usually it does.
Also, I see that there's a question about what do you do when you hire a student mid-semester? How do you train them? So for those students, they have missed orientation. So usually I'll meet one-on-one with those students and kind of just give them an overview of some of the things. So they don't get to participate in the activities, but they still get to learn about things like our service philosophy. Then we get them started on that checklist that all of our students complete. So we get them started on that right away. And then they're usually able to still plug into the larger training games as well. Then we do offer for any students who are hired at the beginning of our winter semester, we do a sort of mini orientation, which is usually just 2 hours long and is a little bit just a condensed version of our longer orientation. So those students who are hired mid-semester, don't have to wait too long until they at least get that mini orientation.
Okay, I think we should move on. There was just one last question whether or not we ask for available hours as part of our selection process. We do require students fill that information out, and you know, that is a task for our supervisor to solve that puzzle, but the peer and collaborative process still works, even though there's always that scheduling issue to work out. Hopefully we can answer a couple more questions at the end, but I'm going to go ahead and turn it back over to Kristen now.
Okay, so let's go ahead and move to the last section of the virtual forum, evaluation. When we think of evaluation in student employment, we think really of both individual performance evaluation as well as the evaluation of the service model as a whole. And while we're happy to talk about what we do in these areas, Brian and I readily admit that this is still an area of growth for us. But let's start with individual performance evaluation. So currently my staff member, Deb, who supervises our UX students, does a formal evaluation with student employees once per academic year, typically in our winter semester. She starts by asking the rest of the staff in our area for specific feedback about the performance of the students that they work with. She then uses that feedback, along with her own observations, of course, to complete an evaluation form, which is actually on our to-do list to update. But she shares the evaluation in a one-on-one meeting with students. And of course, like any good supervisor, she never surprises students here. If there's a problem that we're having with a student, she would definitely provide coaching along the way. Students never find out for the first time about something that they need to work on during the evaluation. We've found that the evaluation does a few things. First, it gives students the experience of having an evaluation before they enter their profession. I remember being really nervous about having my first few professional evaluations, and it's useful for students to get this experience while there's a lot less at stake for them. The evaluation also gives students a formal method for receiving positive feedback, which can really boost their confidence. And of course, if students have had to have some coaching along the way, this is also a way that you can document their progress and perhaps remind them of some of their goals. So far, we haven't added any kind of self-evaluation or peer evaluation piece, but those are things that we've been thinking about, and we'd love to know in the chat box if any of you have implemented something like this. And while you might be typing, Brian's going to talk a little bit about evaluating your student employment program by really evaluating your whole service model.
Okay, thank you, Kristen. If you can move to the next slide for me. While individual performance evaluation is certainly important, one question we get from time to time is whether or not the move to place students as the primary group on our main service desk has been a successful one. So keeping an eye on collective effectiveness is also very important, and the most formal and best way we know how to do that are to conduct things like LibQual. Kristen also regularly analyzes the data we collect at our service point and through our virtual mediums to reinforce the many positive things we're doing and to potentially inform training opportunities for staff and students. Sharing the data your front lines collect with them, by the way, is also an important step to letting them see their successes and keeps the group accountable for logging good information, which is obviously very important. But the LibQual results that we received this past time were really great affirmation for us. We conducted LibQual the last year in our old model, which saw staff as the primary frontline, and again more recently with our newer model. And I'm happy to report that in the dimension of affective service, we received the best results we've ever had when conducting the survey. So the survey asks whether patrons are dealing with employees knowledgeable enough to answer their questions, for example. It also helps evaluate how happy people are with the care in which they receive service. So, you know, we're very proud of our students, as you can tell, and obviously we love talking about them too. So, but there are many different ways to inform the answer to the larger question about how effective or not your service model is working. And we're always curious to hear what others are doing in this area. So again, please type into the chat box, send us a message after the meeting. I want to let people know I'll also be attending the ACRL conference in Baltimore next month and would love to see some of you there. Kristen's really implemented some really cool ideas to garner feedback from students from around our building. We don't have a ton of time to talk to about today, but that's another great way to get informal feedback from our patrons and usually get indicators that things are going pretty well. And they really appreciate our asking those types of questions as well in sort of very low threshold ways. But our next logical step with evaluation will be to develop service desk competencies. We think this will be a great way to monitor effectiveness at the individual and aggregate levels in very specific areas we need our people to perform at. So we don't have a ton of experience with those, so I'll be looking forward to hearing from some of you that have implemented some sort of service desk competencies. But that concludes the presentation portion of the webinar. I think we still have time for about 10 more minutes for more questions if anybody has any.
So I see a question about our average desk shift. So probably the average during the main academic year is probably 3 hours. I would say 3 to 5 hours, so probably maybe 4 hours. We also, you know, on the weekends, students probably do end up working longer shifts. So yeah, so I bet your question is kind of aimed at, you know, do they get really bored at the service desk? And during our peak times, the service desk is pretty busy. We also are asking students to go on roams around the building, and then they also have these opportunities to work on training. So it is during the summer months when they work longer times, that's when the desk shifts can be a little bit more boring, and also on the weekends, but that's sometimes we give them special projects to work on then.
Another question, how do you get all the staff to participate in feedback? I think this is in regards to evaluation. So nobody ever sends me any when I ask for it, or I get a short list of a few, often not helpful adjectives for a handful of students. That actually sounds pretty familiar. I'm not sure how much feedback our student supervisors get, but I think it's very important that she asks, and as far as I know, she does get some. And as managers, when we hear feedback from concerned staff throughout the year, it's also a nice time for us to remind them that they need to get a hold of that student supervisor and give them feedback. And I think Kristen and I have done a good job to coach those student supervisors to seek out feedback a little bit more proactively throughout the year as opposed to just waiting. So that's been helpful. And I saw another question about retention between the two student groups, you know, our UX student group and our A&D student group, and is there a difference in retention? I really don't think so. By and large, people stick around until they graduate after we hire them. Every once in a while, we see that you know, a student has landed in A&D that maybe would be better versed for front of the house, and so sometimes we might lose a student out of A&D to UX, for example, or vice versa. It doesn't happen often, but other than that, you know, for the most part, we retain the majority of our students. And there was a question, did you say you have different supervisors for front and back of the house? Yes, we do. We do. How large is the UX student workforce? Kristen, would you say about? Oh, okay, 20 to 25. Yeah, a little less than that for A&D students. Do your staff shelving students participate in your trainings and work the desk too? No, they do not participate in user experience trainings or work the service desk environment. They do also have a probably 3/4 of a day long orientation. So Kristen and I and our other managers are pretty exhausted that first week before fall classes start, because we do try to attend all of the orientations, and we have 3 or 4 of them. But they have much different things that they focus on with their ongoing training and with their orientation, and there's some overlap. So there are a few opportunities to you know, provide them with the same level of training. A few folks have asked about pay, want to bring it back up. Did you increase compensation with increased responsibility? Any pay differentials based on time of work shift? No, I don't believe there is shift differential for student employees. In the state of Michigan, we've had a variety of minimum wage increases that happen to have aligned with our new service model, and so I don't know how privy or not our students are to what's happening in the state of Michigan with minimum wage. Well, probably I'd be surprised, but they've happened to have gotten some nice compensation out of that over the years, and we do also give them you know, some wage increases as they progress with us. Other questions, Kristen? Do you see any others?
Yes, there was one question about whether or not our students collect fines and register new patrons, or if they just provide basic reference and checkbooks in and out. That's a great question. Yeah, they do all tasks that traditionally would be at a circulation desk, so they do checkbooks in and out, of course. We don't have a lot of, they do collect fines, but we don't have a lot of that because we don't have buy-ins on our regular GVSU materials, but they would do that. We also don't have a lot of new patron registration because that's all kind of happens automatically with our ILS, so just a little bit of that happens. But yeah, so we get a lot of questions about building technology. We get a lot of campus directional information, so they're answering all of those questions as well.
So a couple questions about staff. So what other responsibilities do your student supervisors have outside of managing student workers? Our user experience student supervisor is more or less our CERT guru, and she handles a lot of patron account issues, our state consortia communications at some degree. So she has a couple of other high-level responsibilities that take up quite a bit of her time. And then our access and delivery student supervisor oversees our mailroom operation, and that's a pretty involved and complex set of processes. She oversees stacks management, and then we have an automated storage and retrieval system that she also helps us to make sure work is getting done. So they all have some high-level things that they oversee in addition to just being the student supervisors. What do our staff working the desk environment, or that perch environment Kristen described you when, let me see, you mentioned, what other responsibilities do your student supervisors have? I just answered that one. So our desk staff, I think, was the question, and what do they do at the perch? So they answer virtual chat, they answer phones. They also provide a lot of event support in our new library, which is pretty time consuming, to help coordinate some of those things. Kristen, do you have other things to add about what desk staff do?
Well, so we have 4 UX staff. So in addition to working scheduled hours at the perch, again, as Brian mentioned, they do a lot of event coordination, detail work. They're answering questions that are coming through our library, email, and then they're working on a variety of initiatives that our UX team is putting on. So, for example, maybe helping on our stress relief activities for exam cram. Some of them are, we do a lot of data collection. We do a lot of UX research projects where we're observing how people are using the space. We do a lot of, like we mentioned before, like where we go up and we interview students about various topics. So they're participating in all of those UX initiatives. Some of them are analyzing that data and that kind of thing.
Another important note about what staff are able to do, one of the I guess concerns they raised as we went through this transition was they just didn't have enough time to focus on their own professional development or to have more flexibility in their day-to-day work schedules. And so this model has bought us some of that time. And so we're very big on supporting professional development and have a little bit more flexibility to accommodate that now. I mentioned earlier that some of our access and delivery staff also work the desk environment. And so kind of the difference in what their role is when they're spending their time off desk, they might be helping us support things like course reserve processing, mailroom processing, perhaps interlibrary loan a little bit. So that's sort of the difference in focus between the UX and A&D staff questions. And I think we might just have time for one last question. Kristen, do you see a question there that you'd like to answer?
So I'll answer the question about whether or not we have student mentors like we do staff mentors. We do not currently have a formal student mentorship program, but we do involve our returning students in all kinds of peer learning opportunities. So they're the ones who are helping train new students, and again, by participating in things like recruiting, some of them help us plan orientation. So they're not like meeting with other students one-on-one like we do with the student learning plan, but they do kind of play a mentorship role. And I think our time with that is up for today. So I want to thank everybody so much for participating. The link to the recording of this, as well as an evaluation, will be sent via email next week. There'll also be a spot on the evaluation to suggest additional forum topics, and especially if you'd like to volunteer to host one. So the next virtual forum is coming up on Tuesday, April 11 from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time. It's called How Patron Bashing is Killing Our Spirit, and it will make you think about the effects of venting on us, on our patrons, and on our ability to give great service. Part of this was presented at ALA's Access Services Feast and was really well received. So it's definitely going to be a good use of your time, and you shouldn't miss it. And the registration for that forum will be included in the email that we sent with the recording and the evaluation. So with that, I think we're finished, and we just wanted to, again, thank you and to tell you to go out and keep doing your amazing work, Access Services friends.
Yes, thank you, everybody, and have a great afternoon. We look forward to hearing and seeing some of you soon.